Welcome to a joint seminar between the Center for International Security and Cooperation and the Cyber Policy Center, both at the Freeman Spogli Institute at Stanford University. Thanks for joining us. My name is Colin Call. I'm the Social Science Co-Director at CSAC. And we thought that we would convene a seminar at the intersection of the work that CSAC and the Cyber Policy Center does to examine the relatively new report by the Cyberspace Solarium Commission. The commission itself was established in the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2019 to develop a consensus on a strategic approach to defending the United States in cyberspace from cyber attacks of significant consequence, and to identify associated steps that both Congress and the executive branch could take to thwart those attacks. The finished report was presented to the public on March 11th, so essentially a month ago. The report, as you'll hear from some of our panelists, proposes a strategy of what they call layered defense, and clearly somebody at the Pentagon was responsible for this particular image, since it has in-state on the left and lots of layers and icons. Hopefully the strategy is a little deeper than the slide. As you can see from the screen here, the strategy of layered deterrence envisions efforts to shape international behavior, including norm building, to deny benefits to potential targets, to encourage deterrence by denial, and to impose costs to encourage deterrence by punishment. And the report provides dozens and dozens of associated recommendations to implement the strategy. So to discuss this report, we have a terrific panel which cuts across all of the various centers and institutions that I think collaborate so well together here at Stanford on these issues. First up will be Dr. Jackie Snyder. Jackie was involved with the commission as an advisor, although you should not blame her for things you disagree with in the report, and I'm sure she will have a voice offer her own constructive criticisms perhaps. Jackie, in her day job as a Hoover Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford and a CSAC affiliate, her research focuses on the intersection of technology, national security, and political psychology, with a particular interest in cybersecurity, unmanned technologies, and Northeast Asia. Before beginning her academic career, she spent 6 years as an Air Force officer in South Korea and Japan, and is currently a reservist assigned to U.S. Cyber Command. After Jackie will be Dr. Herb Lin. Herb is a senior research scholar for cyber policy and security at CSAC and the Hank J. Holland Fellow in cyber policy and security at Hoover. His research interests focus on the policy-related dimensions of cybersecurity and cyberspace, including the use of offensive operations in cyberspace as instruments of national policy, and in the security dimensions of information warfare and influence operations. After Herb, we'll hear from Professor Amy Ziegert. Amy is a senior fellow at FSI, a professor of political science by courtesy at Stanford, and the Davies Family Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution, where she directs the Robert and Marion Oster National Security Affairs Fellows Program. From 2013 to 2018, Amy was my able predecessor as the social science co-director at CSAC, and she was also the founder and co-director of the Cyber Policy Program, which evolved into the Cyber Policy Center. Her areas of expertise include cybersecurity, U.S. intelligence and foreign policy, drone warfare, and political risk. Last but not least, we'll hear from Andy Grotto. Andy is a William J. Perry International Security Fellow at Stanford's Cyber Policy Center and a research fellow at Hoover. His research focuses on the national security and international economic dimensions of America's global leadership in information and technology. And at the Cyber Policy Center, he directs the program on geopolitics, technology, and governance. Before coming to Stanford, Andy was the senior director for cybersecurity policy on the National Security Council staff for both Presidents Obama and President Trump. Each panelist will speak for no more than 10 minutes, and you can use your Q&A button to ask questions throughout, and I will curate and pose those questions to the speakers once they're done with their presentation. So without further ado, Jackie, we'll shift over to you, and I will stop sharing my screen here unless you would like me to continue doing that. Yeah, so Jackie, over to you.
All right, well, thanks so much for convening this, especially in this kind of crazy time period. So I'm going to talk a little bit, give a little bit of background on the original intent of the commission. and then kind of how it transitioned. I was a senior policy advisor on the commission. I worked directly for Task Force 1, which was the DoD task force. So I will talk a little bit about what I like from the report, some things that I think should not be overlooked and deserve more debate, and then talk a little bit about where I think maybe the report punted or could have done more or could have done less, and talk a little about that. So for those of you who are not aware, the Solarium Commission was really I think I would call it the brainchild of Congressman Gallagher. And he had done his PhD work on the Eisenhower Solarium Commission, which is a nuclear, a commission that was stood up during kind of the nuclear era to try and compete different nuclear strategies against each other. And so the idea was that you would put people who were extraordinarily expert in this almost like a debate against each other. So the idea originally was to debate 3 coherent strategies against each other in cyberspace. But this commission started right after the DoD, the NSC, and DHS had already just written strategies. So there were not 3 like actually cohesive competing strategies. Instead, there were 3 kind of broad ideas. And so these ideas were deterrence was supposed to be one of the pillars to be competed. The other one was norms, and the third was persistent engagement. Now, we can talk a little bit more about why persistent engagement disappeared from the report almost completely. That's a little inside baseball for you. So what ended up happening was that people realized that these things were all kind of connected to one another. And there weren't strong advocates for each one of these separately, minus persistent engagement. And so what ended up happening is that the task forces kind of evolved into different focus areas. So the deterrence task force actually turned into more of it was supposed to be a State Department-led task force. State Department didn't have enough people, so there ended up being a lot of kind of focus with DHS. And then the norms and deterrence kind of melded into each other, and we ended up having people who were focused on kind of domestic security and the focus on the domestic side. And then the last, which was probably the most cohesive task force, was the one I worked on, which started as persistent engagement, turned into more about defend forward. And that third task force was really about what the DoD was supposed to do. So it turned into basically DoD, State Department, DHS. So it ended up being almost like a 3-agency perspective to cyber. So you should look at this strategy. You can look at this commission report differently than how you would look at, for example, the AI Commission report, because the AI Commission report is focused on defense. The Cyberspace Solarium Commission was supposed to be bigger than defense. It's supposed to be the entire interagency of the US government. So it really transitioned into a lack of competition between these 3 task forces and more of just kind of a giant collaboration exercise. And I think you see that in the final report. There's not a significant amount of prioritization that's done between recommendations. So probably the biggest kind of internal fight for Task Force 1, which was the task force I was working with, was this problem of we were congressionally mandated to talk about persistent engagement as like a core part of the strategy. And persistent engagement is a phrase that came from the Cyber Command vision, in which they said they would persistently engage all the time. And there was a pretty significant fight between whether Cyber Command was going to be leading this task force, or whether it was going to be something that was more focused at the Office of the Secretary of Defense. And the Office of the Secretary of Defense had come up with a concept called defend forward at the same time. So it turned into a bit of a match between OSD and Cyber Command about whose concept was the most important. But behind that report, there was probably about 150 to 200 pages of scholarly work on these different concepts and how they apply to larger strategy. A lot of that is not in the report, and that's for a reason. And that's because the person who ran this project, that ran the commission, is a guy named Mark Montgomery, the executive director. And Mark had a very pragmatic approach to this commission. The idea behind this report was not to create a great kind of scholarly work of strategy, but instead was to create recommendations that could actually be put into legislation. And so that's the ultimate focus of this. This is a very, very pragmatic report. I think that's the differentiation between it and maybe like previous defense science boards. I don't think you see a lot of kind of new ideas when you're thinking about cyber and strategy or cyber and deterrence. But what you do see is that each one of the ideas is very tightly linked to a recommendation that can either fit into the National Defense Authorization Act or that can be legislated by Congress. So the focus here was to find kind of pieces of legislation that are actually happening. There's not a lot of legislation that actually gets passed, and put those recommendations right in there. So the report is aimed squarely at action. Because DoD legislation is the legislation that is routinely passed, you'll see there's a preponderance of recommendations that would fit within an NDAA. That's because it's the easiest piece of legislation to actually pass. And you should note that a lot of the recommendations are actually bureaucratic changes in the way we govern or organize cyber. So you see the empowering of different organizations like CISA at DHS, or the increasing of bureaucratic control within agencies. So they recommend an assistant Secretary of State within the Secretary of State for cyber specifically. They also recommend looking at the Cyber National Mission Force to see whether that should be grown, whether it should be given its own authorities. And there's a big discussion about information warfare authorities, and authorities to acquire your own technology, and then potentially increasing that Cyber National Mission commander to a higher star. So these are all kind of moves that are trying to increase the bureaucratic focus within the US government on cyber. So that's a very big organizational play that's happening in here. You should also notice the focus on election security, which, believe it or not, pre-pandemic was the most important national security threat that the commissioners thought cyber should deal with. And it's funny, if this report had been done after the pandemic, I think there would have been a lot more discussion about healthcare and some other critical infrastructure sectors. But you see a very specific focus on election security. So what do I like about this? I like everything I wrote. Just kidding. But there are some pieces that I want to highlight. And one is, there's a lot of legislation in here, pieces of legislation about talent, about hiring. There's a recommendation to look at creating a cyber strategic reserve in the military, but there are also recommendations for civilian reserve corps within the US government, and allocating more resources to both hiring talent in the cybersecurity, but also decreasing the administrative burden that we have within the US government in bringing people in, retaining them, or letting them go in and out between civilian and private sector and government. And that's actually something that the reason why you see quite a few recommendations throughout the report about that is because it's one of those things that both Democrats and Republicans were really excited about. So Mark knew there was a lot of legislative support for these particular initiatives. And we did a lot of deep diving on what could work, what kind of flexible arrangements we could give so that we could have new methods for bringing in talent. On the DoD side, it's really interesting that the report is basically recommending empowering the cyber mission force and telling the DoD basically to focus on critical infrastructure instead of cyber support to warfighting operations. That's kind of a big bureaucratic move for the DoD. Very rarely do joint organizations have a lot of autonomy, or they lose in the budget fight because they don't have a service fighting for them. And the Cyber Mission Force is a weird joint organization that is not spearheaded by the Air Force, the Navy, and the Marines, the Army. And so this is a very interesting kind of, it's like a not quite Space Force. And Mill innovation scholars would say that we very rarely see things like this succeed. So we'll see kind of how that ends up panning out. I think the report really tried to force the White House's hand at regaining leadership over cyber within the federal government. The way the strategies flowed out in 2018, they went Cyber Command, OSD, and then the White House. And strategy should never flow that way. That is the wrong pyramid. And so the report basically wants to flip it and say, Cyber Command, you don't tell NSC what to do. The NSC and the White House figures out an overarching strategy, and then it goes to DoD, and then Cyber Command, you execute on your vision. So part of the reason why you see persistent engagement kind of disappear in this report is because they were told that's a Cyber Command vision, and strategy needs to go the other direction, not Cyber Command up. So even though the CNMF was really empowered, Cyber Command was kind of the ideational part was kind of told to take a back seat. One of the largest impacts that we'll probably see is if any of the recommendations to fund research centers actually get implemented. So the report recommends both keeping cyber statistics, which is really important for measuring effectiveness, but the commission never figured out measuring effectiveness. So that's a first stage. And then they actually are recommending something that looks a little bit like a CDC, but for cyber threats, which is a nice and interesting kind of balance between what people have been putting maybe too much power to DoD, and this is kind of a nice in between for the federal government. And then you really see like the DHS has some big wins in this report, and especially they're supposed to be in charge of a lot of these research centers. So you can see that if these things were to be implemented, DHS would also come out having more control and more authority over cyber threats in the US government. Something that you should not overlook and that needs a lot more debate are the recommendations about supply chain vulnerabilities and industrial policies. My impression is this was very, very contentious among legislators, because there's a heavy hand here about industrial policy that both Democrats and Republicans dislike for different reasons. Now, the political atmosphere that this report was written in which people were very risk averse, is not the political climate that is happening today. And we've seen, you know, with the standing up at the Defense Production Act, for example, to support COVID-19, that we might actually be in a political situation where people are much more willing to talk about industrial policy and supply chain vulnerabilities. Okay, so those are all good things. Just a short critique. Oh my gosh, we didn't need any more deterrence. Oh my gosh, this layered cyber deterrence thing is an onion that never needed to exist. One of the biggest problems with the strategies in the past has been their inability to define concepts. And if they couldn't define a concept, it became deterrence. And so deterrence became everything. And when deterrence is everything, it is nothing. And I think for those who study the deterrence, you would look at this report and say, almost all of the things you're talking about are not deterrence. And quite often the DoD uses deterrence as its kind of overarching objective when they don't want to have to measure its success. So I was not a huge fan of the introduction of this very complicated deterrence thing. Also, the strategies that were written in 2018 had concepts like persistent engagement and defend for it that were not articulated clearly. And we had an opportunity here to clearly articulate what we thought those concepts meant and what types of activities came under them. And the report punts on that. They say impose costs, deny benefits, which is another kind of, it sounds smart, but it's really, it's not specific enough to help with strategic implementation. And I have a piece on Lawfare blog where I try and actually define what each of those, like what defend for means and persistent engagement. But the report decided that was not something they were gonna work on. And then like defend for, it's not deterrence. So that was my biggest beef, is kind of the strategic part of it. There's also just in general a lack of prioritization. And when you're in a budget environment that we were in pre-corona, maybe, okay, maybe they could have gotten all these things that they asked for. But the reality now is that a lot of these things are going to be expensive, and they're going to be a lot tougher decisions that are made about what actually makes it into legislation and what doesn't, both in terms of allocation of resources, but also allocation of time. Like, is anybody going to sit down and debate some of these issues when we have like real pressing domestic and national security issues going on with public health? So I think that's something they missed on, which the lack of prioritization. And then just finally, I just don't think commission reports should ever open with Singer fiction, personally. So I wish they had not included that. I thought it took away some of the seriousness of what they're really trying to do. So that's kind of my 2 cents about the report, and I'm happy to field questions afterwards.
Great, Jackie. I'm disappointed that you don't like fiction and social science, since pretty much all my social science is fiction. But in any case, Herb, I think you're next on deck. No, seriously, Jackie, thank you.
So there's I have some slides which I'm not intending to go over thoroughly. These are all, except for my last 2 slides, these are all in the commission report. As Colin pointed out, there's this construct of layered deterrence. They make an very interesting observation that deterrence relies on a resilient economy that can reconstitute itself after a serious cyber attack. Boy, it would be nice to have that now, wouldn't it? So having a resilient economy that can reconstitute itself after a disaster, significant disaster like cyber or like a biological pandemic would have been a good thing. Government reform, that is, government should operate properly, should do the right things, and agencies should be empowered to do things. How about that? That's a good thing to do. They do make the point the Federal Service for Cybersecurity should be as attractive to top talent as Facebook or Google. That's going to be interesting. They talk about private partnerships, private-public partnerships yet again. I've been hearing that term for 30 years in the cybersecurity business, and I'm now allergic to the phrase. And then they talk about election security as being a priority. And they in fact make the argument that there should be a paper trail, and that is actually the jumping off point for another important point I'm going to make later. What makes layered cyber deterrence different? Well, they prioritize deterrence by denial, and they talk about defend forward, and so on. Both of those things seem to me to have many interesting similarities to approaches that we take towards counterterrorism. We want to always be in the adversaries' networks. We're always trying to collect intelligence on them. We're always trying to disrupt ongoing operations and so on. It sounds very much like that approach, and maybe there's something to be learned from it. On the other hand, it's not clear to me that the overall approach to doing cyber terrorism is, in fact, it foresages a forever world of being actively mixing it up with them, and that's not deterrence. You don't deter terrorism. You can only sort of squash it down and try to disrupt it and suppress. They make recommendations grouped into 6 pillars. I'm not going to go through all of these, but those are the first 3. Reform the U.S. government, strengthen norms and non-military tools, promote resilience, reshape the ecosystem towards better security, operationalize cybersecurity cooperation with the private sector, and employ the military and other options to deter cyber attacks across the entire spectrum of conflict. By the way, including election hacking and theft of intellectual property. It's not clear what that means to say prevail in those things, but anyway. One of the most interesting things about it that's buried in the text of the report, although not in the recommendations, is that last bullet there under the asterisk. To conduct preemptive cyber attacks against adversaries. Let's see, I got to move the screen here, so I can't tell. Yeah, and to force a shift in the adversaries' activities from offense to defense. That's an interesting approach. That's the only part in it that, as far as I can tell, that has any sort of strategic logic to it. You may disagree with it, but at least there's a logic to it. I wonder if anybody was really understood that they were talking about preemptive cyber operations to disrupt adversarial activity. And I think that that snuck by, but that's really embedded there in the report. So my primary, I have 2 slides of commentary. I mean, so all the recommendations are good, at least most of them not particularly harmful. if well executed, but few are new, and you know, same for their rationales. In the pre-conference here, I was sort of thinking that, you know, okay, there's some things that are good out of that, not a problem, but there was all this effort and all this energy and all this money spent to produce an elephant, and they produced a couple of useful mice. Okay, I mean, you know, something's useful. The most important part about it was the orientation towards action, towards congressional action, and I think that was unique and different. But of course, the Congress and the executive branch are focused on other things now. Remember, this report was released on March 11th. I mean, it is now April 21st, right? That's a very short time ago, and everything is different now. Anyway, I note that many of the ideas in the report are relevant to what's happening now. For example, the continuity of the economy, and I note that lots of the report calls for strengthening U.S. government institutions and also for international cooperation. On the other hand, I note that the United States isn't at least presently, isn't particularly oriented towards wanting to be internationally engaged or partnering even with traditional allies. So getting that through the administration is going to be interesting. It struck me in this that, you know, the United States is not is not only the deterrer, it can also be the deterred party. And we don't really ever like to talk about the fact that we might be deterred too. We say, no, we're never going to be deterred. We're just going to pursue what we want to regardless of the cost. Well, that's not necessarily true. And sort of the discussion of the escalatory implications of defending forward and persistent engagement, they really aren't addressed in the report at all. I note that a key driver of US vulnerability in cyberspace is the idea, they say this right up front, that we're going to become more and more dependent on information technology, 5G, Internet of Things, all that sort of stuff, okay? And they never question that proposition. That to them is a given. But of course, if you're going to go in that direction, you're going to have more vulnerabilities. And in fact, they recognize this point when they make the point that there should be a paper trail for voting. Voting is so critical that you don't want to go all out for computers. You have to have something that's low tech. You have to have some backup. So you have to be willing to give up some of the functionality and economy and so on that utter dependence on information technology would give you. I wish they had expanded that more. Sometimes we need to say, no, we're not going to computerize X, Y, or Z. I mean, you know, you can get a Bluetooth-enabled refrigerator now, and toothbrush. I mean, anyway. To execute on the operational agenda, there's an enormous amount of intelligence that you need. It's going to have to be persistent and ubiquitous. That is everywhere in the world. And it's going to have to be both foreign and domestic to do what they want to do. Amy may have more comments about that. I wonder how popular that's going to be with the American people. This construct of deterrence has always been based on rational calculations of cost and benefit, but decision makers are human and they often don't make decisions rationally. That fact is never acknowledged in any of this. Talked about how the logic isn't explained, and a major omission. The report doesn't talk about the fact that we use offensive operations on other nations and other parties to further our national goals. Like, we do it for a whole lot of spying, okay? And you can argue that's an okay thing to do. And I think it's an okay thing to do, but we never talk about the fact that we do this stuff too. We want to cripple Chinese and Russian and Syrian or whatever weapon systems using cyber means. We want to do all of that stuff as well. And we never say anything in that report, just never addresses any of the policy issues associated with that. So that's my last slide, and over to you, Colin.
Thanks, Herb. I wish you weren't such a shrinking violet. Tell us what you really mean. Amy, you're up next.
It's always bad to go behind Jackie and Herb. They said all the interesting things. What I want to do, and I have no fancy slides, I just have some thoughts, and the thoughts really fall into three categories. And let me just say, actually, before I jump in, that we did not talk to each other about what we were going to say. So the fact that you're going to see a lot of convergence on what we like, what we don't, is actually, I think, pretty illuminating. So we did not compare notes until about 30 seconds before we got on today. So I want to talk about context, highlights, and what I see are the biggest missed opportunities from this commission. In terms of context, I have actually spent a ridiculous and silly amount of time looking at commissions. And so what are they good for anyway? That's what I want to start with. Turns out commissions are as old as the Republic. George Washington appointed the first commission to try to stop the Whiskey Rebellion in 1794. And it's a pretty telling omen that that commission failed. We've had sort of problematic issues with commissions ever since. Just to give you some sense, in one 20-year period of the commissions I looked at, there were 700 different commissions, 200 of them in foreign policy alone. So lots of commissions, most of them don't get very far. As one official told me, Washington is littered with the carcasses of dead reports from commissions. So all commissions cover lots of different things, but they all share one thing in common, which is that they're addressing issues that the normal processes and organizations of government are failing to address. So the fact that you're appointing a commission is an indicator that the existing operation of government is failing, right? If it were succeeding, you wouldn't need a commission in the first place. And there are really three sets of problems that give rise to commissions, and they're the three I's: interest groups, institutions, and ideas, right? So interest groups are blocking smart things from happening. So think about regulation of political ads on online platforms, for example. Institutions are guarding their turf. There's not a lot of rationalization about who does what. We see this in spades, right, in cybersecurity. And then ideas. And many commissions arise because policymakers just don't have the time to come up with the answers to really difficult problems. So this particular commission, I think, has the highest degree of difficulty because it's trying to combat all three of those I's: interest groups, institutions, and ideas in a fast-moving landscape. So kudos to them for even trying to take this on, because I think this is the hardest area for a commission to deal with. And I think given the degree of difficulty, they did a really good job. So that's sort of the context. Let me say highlights, I think, and Jackie and Herb already talked about this, but it bears repeating because it's so unusual. The process of this commission is actually really good. It is action-oriented from the beginning. It's bipartisan. It's a publicly available report, and it's well-written, which is also rare for a commission report. So it's designed to actually educate not only legislators and people in the executive branch, but the American people. And so that's actually really important. And it's designed to move into action, which most commissions are not. It's a very smart approach. Two big ideas, I think, are in my view, the greatest contribution. The first, and it'll be no surprise to people who know that I obsess about organizational structure, the emphasis on organizational structure is actually really important and often overlooked. The commission report writes, in democratic governance, structure is policy. That alone is actually really important. And they're tackling structure both in the executive branch and in the legislative branch. So their diagnosis of the problem is correct. I can argue about their specific wiring diagrams for various things, but they diagnosed the right problem, which is that there's an incoherent structure in the executive branch. There's an incoherent structure in the legislative branch with 50 to 60 different congressional committees and subcommittees involved in cyber. And we will never get cyber right if we don't try to rationalize both the executive branch and the legislative branch. Senator King has a great phrase that I am now going to steal forever, which is that the president needs one throat to choke, right? So there needs to be one person who is responsible for overseeing how cyber looks across the economy, across DOD, across DHS, one throat to choke. That alone is kind of worth the commission report, I think. So I think that is an important contribution. The second big contribution is the focus on continuity of the economy as a concept and the need for planning about continuity of the economy. If you think that our economic power is national power, in this world and in this iteration of geopolitics, which I happen to agree with, then that is a critical change in how we think about what the role of government is. So I think those are two big contributions of the commission. So I'm more optimistic. I'm surprised. I'm usually more pessimistic than Herb, but in this case, I'm more optimistic than Herb. Let me just briefly go through what I think are the big missed opportunities of this report. And Jackie and Herb touched on the first one, which is, oh my God, deterrence. What have they done with this term? Deterrence has now become magic fairy dust for anything somebody wants to sound smart about, but has no idea how to solve the problem. So they completely punted on deterrence in cyberspace. There's this phrase of layered cyber deterrence, and Colin, you had the opening slide, and it looked really fancy and good, and it had 3 things on it. We want to shape behavior, we want to impose costs, we want to deny benefits, but it means basically nothing in the context of cyberspace. So we know that successful deterrence requires 3 things, right? And they're almost all rarely met in cyberspace. You have to know who your adversary is. You have to make clear what behavior you're not going to tolerate. And you have to show the punishment that you could inflict if they actually cross the Rubicon. All 3 of those things are almost never present in cyberspace. Cyber attacks, we know, are frequently anonymous, and the attribution problem isn't going to get solved permanently anytime soon. What are the cyber Rubicons that if you cross, we're going to take drastic action against you? We still don't know the answer to that question, right? And we certainly don't know what punishment various actors can inflict if you do cross the Rubicon, because there are huge incentives not to reveal, at least in cyberspace, your cyber capabilities for punishment. Recognizing that, of course, punishment can be non-cyber means, but in cyberspace, there are huge incentives for us not to show what it is that we can do. We don't see when Kim Jong-un is parading missiles and his newest hardware, he's not parading algorithms, right? The Chinese Communist Party isn't parading their coders in their military parades. And the reason is, if we showcase our cyber capabilities, then our adversaries can render them useless or turn them against us. And so as one person involved in the commission put it, how do you deter when you can't do the equivalent of an above ground nuclear test in cyberspace, which is we tested above ground more than we needed to during the Cold War to show what we could do if somebody crossed that red line. Can't do that in cyberspace. So a better strategy, I think, and what I wish the commission had done, is by recognizing that deterrence is not the magic answer to any problem, and to identify more explicitly where cyber deterrence can work, where it cannot work, and how. That would have been a huge contribution, and they ducked it completely. And then finally, just briefly, practically, I think there's a practical need that I wish the commission had met, which is to spend more energy on the fancy category of things that I call stopping stupid, right? So it's great to have highbrow strategy, organizational reform, authorities and structures, but most of our problems in cyber defense are we can't get the basics right. So there's a lot of talk about the OPM breach, the Office of Personnel Management, 22 million records stolen by the Chinese in 2015. It had nothing to do with cyber deterrence. It had to do with the fact that OPM didn't have 2-factor authentication protecting its records. So stopping the stupid stuff, getting the basics right, is incredibly important. The commission waxed eloquently about how we need to use the cloud more, but I learned last week it takes 18 months for a new tool from Amazon Web Services to get approval inside the intelligence community. You can't have progress if you can't stop the stupid stuff at the beginning. So when government agencies are operating on outdated technology, it's hard to keep up with adversaries. It's hard to lure the top talent. We can't get any of that good stuff unless we get the basics right. And I wish the commission had spent more time actually on getting those basic operational things right. Other than that, I loved it.
That's great, Amy. I like stop stupid stuff. That's a good mantra from the Obama years and a good segue to an Obama alum and Trump NSC alum. I will just say that one of my favorite things that I've read on Twitter in the last couple months is a new international relations theory called hegemonic stupidity theory. That when the hegemon does stupid things, the world falls into crisis. Andy, I think that's a good segue to you. How can
Thanks, Colin. Well, and thanks to all of our listeners and viewers for joining us. You know, I have I guess the challenge of going batting cleanup here again. You know, after three really outstanding presentations. I guess the first thing I'll say is I associate myself with the remarks of my colleagues who spoke before me. So the report, you know, is very solid in its recommendations, and as my colleagues have noted, you know, those recommendations are predominantly focused on organizational processes and structures. But I have to say, you know, as a marker in the evolution of thinking about cyber policy in the United States, it was also an intensely frustrating read for me. I've been involved in virtually every major cyber policy debate in the last 10 years, from my time working in the US Senate on the first major package of cyber legislation in 2012, to NSC Senior Director for Cyber Policy in both the Obama and the Trump White Houses. The report is mostly a repackaging of ideas that have been, you know, in some cases have been around in some form or another for 5 or 10 plus years. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. You know, the Solarium leadership and its key commissioners are members of Congress from both parties. So, you know, if the report is able to rally political support for carrying some common sense ideas across the legislative finish line, that's a huge victory for security and innovation. And that's because Congress, in my experience, has been the biggest speed bump to getting cyber policy to where it needs to be in the United States. You know, I think Amy's point on that was spot on. I'll also note that, you know, Amy's perspective on commissions past and in this case present are spot on. That idea was also a major driver of the commission that President Obama established on cyber in his last year of office, which Herb Lynn actually served on as a commissioner. I had the privilege of drafting the executive order that created that commission. And then the idea there was to essentially articulate an agenda for Congress in 2017. Now, you know, a lot of the cyber problems that I experienced during my time in government, many of them did have to do with process and structure. Mission, you know, battles over whose mission takes precedent, battles over jurisdiction, battles over prestige and resources. And Congress is responsible for defining the mission and jurisdictional boundaries of federal agencies. It also authorizes how money is spent and appropriates that money. And you know, that lack of clarity around jurisdictional and mission boundaries made the interagency battles that I was involved in at the White House far more intense and pitched than they should have been. I'll give you an example. So PPD 41 was the presidential policy directive that President Obama signed in 2016 that established the federal incident response plan for significant cyber incidents. It's a fair question to ask. Why did it take 8 years to develop a PPD on incident response? And the answer was that the fights and the barriers to action had fundamentally to do with a lack of clarity rooted in statute and mission authority for some of the key agencies involved in incident response, chiefly DHS and FBI. I'll note in that respect that DHS didn't have its core leadership role in civilian cyber policy and cybersecurity formalized until November of 2018. Now that's when CISA was finally created. So, you know, the report would go a long way if its recommendations are implemented, a long way towards dealing with these kind of process structure issues. And so I wholeheartedly agree that the structure is policy, but there's also a lot more to policy than structure. There's still a whole lot of substance. And cyber policy is often about trade-offs, right? So if we think about cyber norms, for example, Herb made this point, you know, we, on the one hand, we ourselves conduct offensive cyber operations at the same time that we're trying to create new norms around the use of offensive cyber operations in statecraft. that's hard to do. Think about encryption, right? There are trade-offs. You have a set of equities concerning law enforcement access to information relevant to public safety on the one hand, and you have on the other hand weaknesses and vulnerabilities that could be introduced if backdoors were implemented widely across products. Regulatory policy, again, trade-offs between baking regulatory mandates into statute that become compliance exercises and don't achieve the goals that we want, versus I think a pretty clear state of affairs where many sectors across the economy are not taking cybersecurity as importantly as they should. Offensive cyber ops, Herb alluded to this as well, the trade-offs there, right? So, cyber operations often occur in, by definition, in other countries' territory. So there's a trade-off there between our ability to use cyberspace as an offensive as a domain for achieving our international objectives on the one hand, and on the other hand, obviously there are significant normative and diplomatic stakes, particularly if we're conducting operations in allied or friendly countries. So making trade-offs is hard. There are winners and losers, and often the trade-offs cut across traditional policy, jurisdictional boundaries, and increasingly in cyber ideological boundaries. And I think, to me, I think in the report, you had sort of these three layers of deterrence. That middle layer, I think, is probably the most important. I call it defense for short. But it's also by far the hardest because of the substantive trade-offs. There is no lack of vision on what an appropriate relationship looks like between the private sector and government. Industrial policy remains at best a trigger word for politicians. My view is that the most important strategic question in the United States when it comes to cyber policy is defining where private responsibility for defending against cyber threat ends and where the federal government's role begins. And that requires a clear vision of what private responsibility means. And in particular, is the market supplying sufficient incentive for private organizations to invest enough in cybersecurity to achieve public policy ambitions? I appreciate that the report raises that question. That I think took courage, but I wish it had an answer. And this will remain, I think, one of the biggest and most impactful open questions in cyber policy. I'll close there. Thank you.
Thanks, Andy. That's great. So we have a bunch of good questions and about 45 minutes to plow through them. I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative to ask a couple questions at the outset, and then I've accumulated a number of them, and we'll get to as many as we can. So I wanted to ask you all to reflect a little bit on the fact that obviously the report came out 6 weeks ago, but the world is completely different 6 weeks later. Jackie, you mentioned, that the fact that we're going to spend $3 or $4 trillion probably digging ourselves out of the economic hole or just treading water economically here may have crowd out effects for things that the commission recommends as a consequence of the Great Depression, essentially, that COVID-19 is likely to produce here. Herb, you mentioned that the pandemic has stress tested resilience and government competence, and needless to say, both have been found relatively wanting. I would love for you all to talk about how COVID-19 might change the world, or maybe already is, in terms of rewiring how people work, how people interact with one another. After all, we're doing this not in person, but over Zoom, and interface with their government, their medical professionals, service providers, and a whole bunch of other things. And, as a non-cyber person, I look at this and I say, wow, as big as the surface area was before to disrupt the American economy, like the surface area to do major disruptions to our way of life has gone up, I don't know, exponentially, certainly more than arithmetically, but I don't know whether that's right or not. And I'd love to hear your views, and anybody, you can all unmute and kind of take a shot.
I'll take a shot at that. I think that your fundamental instinct is right. We're all now on our personal computers, more or less. and we're outside we're all supposed to have it. We all have an affiliation with Stanford. Nominally, we're protected by by a very competent, very, very good, and highly trained, et cetera, IT security force on the campus. And now we're all at home doing interesting things on our home. We're using Zoom, which we know has certain security difficulties. I will bet you that none of us, so the five of us on this call, none of us used our VPNs to get in to Stanford. I didn't. I'd be willing to bet money that nobody else did. That was a dumb thing to not, to do, but I didn't do it. So I think that your instinct is right, that now that we're all dispersed, we have the attack surface is in fact a lot greater, and we don't have the advantages of our corporate IT to help us. I think that's right.
Yeah, I'd like to pick up on that just very specifically for the DoD, because this has revealed a few things for the DoD. I mean, first is kind of what Herb is mentioning, right? So there are people who are moving to telework, and they're using their personal laptop and their Wi-Fi that's protected with password, right? So the overall kind of landscape of potential vulnerability is significantly increased. Usually the DoD would work off, DoD networks, and you would, as a DISA, you would focus on those DoD networks. Well, for a long time, the US government has privileged security over efficiency, and has not worked on creating these kind of flexible, kind of tele-remote work capabilities. And unfortunately, we have to, I think the DoD has found itself really wanting when it comes to this, both in their ability to maintain security, but we knew that some of that was going to give up, but also their ability to maintain kind of effectiveness with virtual technologies. So I think we're going to see, we're already seeing a lot more experimentation when it comes to the DoD's use of new technologies. And that's good. That innovation will be good for the DoD, and their ability to match kind of cybersecurity innovation with the innovation that they have when it comes to teleworking effectiveness. That's going to be like a constant battle, something that we'll see over time. And then one thing I did want to note is, so the report that we just talked about was mostly thinking about election security, and there was already big debates about what role DoD was going to play in election security and cybersecurity of our elections. Now we're seeing calls for the DoD to help with the cyber threats that are emerging towards health infrastructure. And I think that there are concepts that are kind of embedded underneath vague words inside this report that are actually like really helpful. And I think this idea of using Defend Forward, which I would categorize as counter cyber operations to decrease an adversary's ability to conduct cyber attacks, actually attacking, the Russian IRA in their own networks. I actually think there's a role that the DoD can play there. But unfortunately, I'm sure that we'll see a lot of them trying to get the DoD to do kind of baseline cybersecurity for health, which will be a waste a bit of, I think, DoD time.
So I just, if I could jump in, Colin. So this is, of course, we're in the realm of speculation, right? So I'll put my speculation hat on. I think there are three things that we're seeing with COVID-19 that intersect with cybersecurity. The first is the importance of federalism in the United States and the opportunity for state actors, not state as IR theorists call them, right? But state like California, South Dakota, to have a big impact on policy. And I think that it'll be interesting to see whether that spills over from the pandemic response to other areas. We already started to see some of that with consumer privacy laws in California, et cetera. So I think we're likely to see more active state governments as coming out of COVID-19 because they've had to develop the muscles to deal with it in this realm, and it'll carry over to others. Second is, I think we're going to see an accelerated reliance and importance of open source intelligence, precisely for the reasons that Jackie mentioned. I was supposed to get a classified briefing on March 18th, right? I couldn't actually go. And so I still haven't had it. And so then my request was, well, give me all the unclass stuff you've got so that I can get up to speed. So I think you're going to see that dynamic playing out. And as important as it is to have open source intelligence capabilities, now it's going to be even more so if we think about resilience and developing in the IC the tools to be able to better analyze and acquire open source intelligence will take on, I think, greater urgency. And then third and finally, I wonder whether at the international level, the global pandemic will accelerate the race to autonomy. So you see the limits of humans as warfighters in the Theodore Roosevelt. You see how much one virus can incapacitate an aircraft carrier. Boy, if I'm China, I'm thinking about the benefits of autonomy even more than I was before. And so I think we're likely to see an accelerated race to autonomous systems, particularly between the Chinese and the Russians.
So on that, that's great. See, this is another thing where like we didn't pre-cook this, but that's a great transition to my next question, because Amy, you talked about, commissions are as old as the Republic. The Cyber Solarium Commission was going on at the same time that another commission on artificial intelligence, the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence, was also convening meetings, and they're preparing a report. They put out some interim things. And so I'd be curious, and Amy, I know you've done some consulting for them. I'd be curious, Jackie, about the connectivity between the two commissions. But in general, I think I wonder if you all could talk a little bit about how many of the recommendations in here are consistent with a broader prioritization on not just cyber, but other emerging digital technologies, right? Machine learning and artificial intelligence, quantum computing, Internet of Things, 5G, synthetic biology. There's a whole host of, revolutionary digital technologies. And Andy, maybe one thing I'd love to hear your view on, one of the recommendations in the report is to stand up a new office in the Executive Office of the President at the White House for cybersecurity, with a director who would, I guess, sit astride people like the head of the OSCP and the National Security Advisor and the head of the Domestic Policy Council and National Economic Council in terms of the kind of principal advisors to the president. And this person would be Senate confirmed if according to the recommendation. Query whether that's a good idea, and even if it is, or however the White House should play a lead role, whether that person by necessity shouldn't just be a cyber person, right? That it should be cyber and a collection of other emerging technologies that are so intertwined that just having them look at cyber doesn't make any sense. So kind of the two commissions and maybe how the White House organizes itself.
The future says that everything is going to be called, all these things are going to be rolled up under cyber, and the word cyber is just going to be redefined. That's my impression. That's what's happening all over the country already. And anytime you talk about cyber, there's an AI and machine learning, and so on.
I thought all the billboards in the Bay Area just found and replaced cyber and put AI in them. But anyway, I take your point. Jackie or Amy on this commission question?
So I'll speak a little bit to the commission, but I think Jackie probably knows more about the connectivity between them than I do. So I've done some advising for the National Security Commission on AI. There's a lot of connectivity between these two commissions, and I think that's to the benefit of both. So as Jackie mentioned, the AI Commission is really looking principally at defense. And of course, the cyber and AI are tightly connected. Some people use them interchangeably, but if you think about it, you have to have cybersecurity in order to have data integrity, which you have to train algorithms to do the jobs they're intended to do. The flip side is you also have to have more sophisticated algorithms to make sense of the data that's coming in. So they're not the same, but they're highly complementary. And I think, this question about this coordinating role in the White House, I'd be curious to know, Andy, what you think of it. I think it's a good idea to have an office with a single throat to choke, but it's unlikely that it's only going to be cybersecurity. Because if you think about the cyber lens, you're really talking about, for the most part, playing defense. How do we defend? How do we protect? How do we ensure resilience? Yes, there's an offensive component, which Jackie knows a lot about, but it is fundamentally defensive in its orientation. Whereas artificial intelligence has a whole host of applications, as you know, Colin, for our economic vitality, our social mobility, our international projection of power. It's much broader than that. And so I would hope that that position actually is broadened to think about emerging technologies in a whole host of ways.
Yeah, I want to highlight on what Amy said. The relationship between the two commissions. There's a lot of lot of shared space in the Venn diagram, but two that I think are really important. One is the supply chain vulnerabilities. I think the same vulnerability issues that the Cybersecurity Commission was highlighting are probably things that the AI Commission is looking into. Then talent. The talent work seems to be almost completely in step. And what's really interesting is there's a third commission that just released a report, which is the I'm going to get the name wrong, but the Public Service Commission. So it was originally stood up to look at the draft, and then it started looking at kind of selective service and service in general. And one of their recommendations is the development of an individual ready reserve that takes specific talents and capabilities and kind of plates them in like a ready reserve capability where you can just pull them up. And that has, you know, correlations with the medical field, but it also has correlations about things we've been talking about for AI and for cyber. So I think you see like a confluence of these commissions coming together, especially on the talent issue, where you see like similar initiatives that are happening from seemingly independent commissions. So I think you'll see a lot of forward movement on those issues. And then I think supply chain is going to become a big, huge issue that will come up through even after these commissions.
And Andy, on this organization question?
Yeah, so I'm not a fan of Congress legislating the immediate sort of organizational structure around the president. You know, the president is in a unique position to ignore or not, you know, I mean, the president sits at the top of the chain of command, and I come back to a point that Jackie made earlier about, you know, sort of the Cyber Command OSD relationship, and, you know, policy, as it were, flowing from Cyber Command to the NSC as opposed to vice versa. You know, you could have a Senate confirmed, cyber policy, head at the White House sitting on top of some fancy new office, and that person would not have any impact unless the president and the rest of the senior leadership team and the cabinet wanted that person to have that role. And so I just, I think for that kind of position, there's a difference between, Congress wants a single throat to choke, right? That's why they want this person to be Senate confirmed. I think the president, ought to have the option of deciding whether he or she wants a single throat to choke, or whether a function is best served by having some distributed leadership, even if at the end of the day, comes together under, the National Security Advisor, the Homeland Security Advisor, or some other, principal within the White House.
Great. All right, I want to shift gears to our questions from our audience, which is robust, and the questions are great. So I'm going to put out questions kind of in buckets of categories, and then you all can attack them as you see fit. So a couple of questions related to deterrence, and some of this has been answered in the Q&A chat back and forth, but I want to make sure that everybody can kind of chime in and we can have a discussion. So MS, not sure who that is, but MS asks, is penetrating an adversarial system or network and allowing the other side to potentially detect that one has done so the equivalent of an above ground nuclear test, right? Rattling around in their system loudly, not really trying to generate an effect, but demonstrating their vulnerability? Or how does this hold at risk strategy potentially differ in terms of signaling? So that's one deterrence question. And then a second deterrence question, which comes from Scott Sagan, relates to the interrelationship between nuclear threats and cyber threats. So the 2018 Nuclear Posture Review by the Trump administration demonstrates sufficient anxiety about the ability of adversaries to get inside our command, control, and communications networks associated with our nuclear systems and our critical infrastructure, that it makes a threat to use nuclear weapons in retaliation for a major non-nuclear strike on critical civilian and military infrastructure. And the question that Scott had was this deterrent threat discussed in the report, and how should it have been analyzed in detail along with counter arguments against that? So two deterrence questions, one about can we rattle around, make noise, and have like the above ground explosion to signal in the cyber domain, and the other on the nukes cyber intersect.
Can I jump in on the rattling around point briefly, which is that nuclear tests happen within territory that is controlled by, you know, the testing, the actor conducting the test, right? Putting aside atmospheric testing in the in the Pacific, right? I mean, it's a slightly different. But you know, cyber operations occur in someone's territory. Oftentimes, you know, if the idea is to signal it, it's not going to occur in your own territory. It's more, perhaps more akin to, you know, a freedom of navigation operation, or buzzing a border, you know, to flicker on the, you know, the counter aircraft capability. And in some cases, the analogy may be, you know, doing that against a third country who, you know, isn't necessarily party to whatever conflict is underway, but just happens to be the home of the infrastructure that the target, the actual target of the signaling, is using.
So I'll jump in. I think it's a great point that Andy makes. The other huge difference with an above ground nuclear test is you can say, this is a nuclear test. Right? Everybody's clear that it's a test. Whereas if you're rattling around in somebody's network, are you engaged in intelligence collection? Are you preparing the battlefield for an attack? Are you trying to signal that this is a capability you could use should you want to? It's really hard to actually telegraph to your adversary why you're rooting around in their network and what this is about. So we think about, I was reading the news, of course, today, and we see, you know, 2 warships in the South China Sea. What's the signaling idea behind that? In the physical domain, it's hard enough to be clear about what signals you're sending with kinetic assets. In the cyber domain, for the reasons that Andy mentioned and the fact that we can't message in the same way, it's that much more difficult. So I don't think it's equivalent at all.
Yeah, this is something where I had significant debate with other members on the commission. I've done a lot of work on the role that cyber plays in signaling and deterrence in war games, and have found almost no evidence of cyber operations being effective signaling mechanisms within games, for all the reasons that Andrew and Amy have mentioned. I've also done experimental work to look at kind of the emotional salience of cyber operations, and find, once again, very limited evidence that individuals have any sort of emotional reaction to these cyber operations. So all of my kind of empirical work suggests that cyber operations are not good tools for signaling or deterrence. But, oh my gosh, they love using cyber operations for signaling and deterrence. I mean, if your signaling strategy is super, super clever and intricate, it's like too clever by half. And the best mechanisms are those that are blunt mechanisms. And so one of the real debates I had in the commission was, or in my group, was I thought that we should reserve cyber operations were not good uses of deterrence for us. And instead, we should actually signal restraint when it came to the upper ends of cyber activity, strategic cyber attacks. And that by signaling restraint in these kind of attacks against critical infrastructure or attacks against nuclear command and control, that we could, one, not really be holding ourselves back, because these are really awful signals anyway, but 2, allow some sort of credibility that the operations that we take under defend forward, which should not be strategic attacks. Instead, defend forward should be about affecting an adversary's network, counter cyber operations, and that we could signal kind of credibility about our ability to restrain ourselves at this lower level of defend forward without escalation risk, while also saying, hey, we're not going to do this thing at the high end. But if you do that to us, we actually do have really credible means of punishment. And here are kind of the punishment options that we have. But saying, like in the nuclear posture review, that you're going to respond to an unidentified, they were very vague about the significance of the cyber attack with a nuclear response, is not credible, right? So you need to use your other kind of levers. But if you put that bar really, really high, you can actually have strategic deterrence of cyber attacks, while also maintaining this kind of day-to-day degrading of adversary cyber operations. And so for me, when they showed up with layered deterrence, I thought, oh shoot, like I had done all this kind of intellectual work to disentangle the difference between defending forward and strategic cyber deterrence. But I have a paper coming out this summer in the Washington Quarterly that discusses exactly those dynamics.
I will just make as an observation here. As you know, the NPR did not explicitly tie cyber or nuclear response to cyber attacks, but a statement from the Joint Chiefs of Staff in 2004 under the National Military Strategy did, and it even set the scale for what it was, namely a cyber attack that would cause casualties comparable to a relatively small chemical attack. Colin, you're muted.
Sorry, although the NPR does make repeated reference to cyber and other emerging technologies as growing threats to nuclear command and control, and in the same breath then threatens the attack. So I think it's pretty clear what the intent is. Just one, not a cyber expert, but just to share one, I think, cautioning about rattling around, and that is we should learn a little bit about how hard it has been in our own government to figure out what adversaries rattling around in our systems means. So during the 2016 election attacks by the Russians, the GRU was super noisy. They were not, they rattled all around. And it wasn't clear whether it's just because they had primitive tradecraft or they didn't care about getting caught. And there were big debates about what it meant that they didn't care, right? Were they trying to send us a signal? But at the end of the day, those debates didn't matter much because they attacked us, right? So the rattling around itself, whatever their signal was, it was an attack, which drove the US-Russian relationship in a very different direction than it might have otherwise been. And so I think, we see that in ourselves. We shouldn't, I don't know why we wouldn't assume that an adversary wouldn't have a similar, reaction. And the last point I would make on this is, theoretically, you're in a bind because either your rattling around is too small to actually deter, or it's so big that it's seen as a massive attack that risks an escalation. So, like, I don't really understand that particular part of it. All right. Allies and adversaries was another basket of questions. So let me put the two questions on the table, so to speak, and get your reaction. So Andrew DeBerry asks what the role of allies is in the report and should be in policy. Specifically, did the Commission consider cyber principles coming from allies in terms of things like structure and policy, things like secure supply chains and a cybersecurity workforce base across NATO or other alliance structures, industry partnerships to accelerate innovations across allies? So kind of how did the Commission deal with allies? How should we think about that? And then in terms of adversaries, Matt Ellison asks that, says the strengthened norms and non-military tools section of the Commission report mentions a lot of aspects of international norms and mechanisms, but bilateral diplomacy with our principal cyber adversaries does not seem to appear anywhere. Isn't the critical role of cyber diplomacy to engage not just with allies, institutions, and non-aligned countries, but the very adversaries whose behavior in cyberspace we want to change? And I think this is reminiscent of or echoes a concern that a lot of people have, that in this day and age, we have to have strategic stability conversations, which include a lot of different technologies all at the same time, cyber being among them. But okay, allies and adversaries, go.
I know the Commission did travel to quite a few allied countries when they were putting the report together. So I know allied inputs were influential. I can't particularly point out the ones, and we could probably do a better job. On my side, on the Department of Defense side, one of the things we were looking at was a concern that a former Stanford scholar, Max Smeets, had brought up about whether Defend Forward was actually causing rifts with our allies. And there was not a lot of empirical evidence of that. And in fact, some allies actually prefer US to be much further leaning in cyberspace. So there are some so there was less, I don't think the report dealt with it very explicitly, but there is a lot of background work that was done by other scholars on alliance relationships, and that some of that stuff should be publishing. On the adversary norms thing, actually one of the things I worked on in the commission was how the DoD can be a norm entrepreneur, and the US government can be a norm entrepreneur. So thinking about kind of methods outside of just traditional UNGGE or diplomatic channels, what are ways that you can create stability between like the US and Russia or the US and China. And so one of the things I was recommending, which obviously didn't make it into the final report, was more senior level discussions between military and intelligence cyber officials, between adversary nations and the United States, and kind of moving into kind of a more diverse kind of diplomatic discussions that were outside strictly the State Department channels.
Anybody else on allies and adversaries? All right. Let me ask a question, switch gears for a minute and talk about issues related to things like the cyber workforce and the role of the private sector. So Steve Krasner had asked a question right at the beginning about the discussion of compensation and pay to make sure that the cyber workforce in the federal. Now I assume he was asking about this not because Steve plans a second career as part of the cyber workforce. I strongly believe that is not going to happen, but because I think because of this notion of making sure that we can attract talent into the federal government to work on cybersecurity when they could be making hundreds of thousands of dollars working for Silicon Valley firms or folks in Austin, Texas, or Seattle or wherever. So kind of how can we incentivize the right type of people to come into the cyber workforce? And then Sydney Frankenberg asks, how did the commission consider the role of private industry in contributing to the overall security posture of the nation? What is the role of the government in protecting private companies from cyber attacks by nation states? And Mike McNerney then put a comment that kind of flipped it on its head, which is in the aftermath of COVID-19 and all of us moving to virtual work relationships and interactions. The private sector, especially large infrastructure providers like AWS and Google Cloud and others, right? That backbone of infrastructure is going to be even more important to national cybersecurity than it was before. So kind of how much should the government protect the private sector, but also how should the private sector protect the government and us? So workforce and private sector.
Maybe on workforce, I think obviously salary matters, right? People want to make more money than less, but the federal government is never going to be able to compete with the private sector head to head for talent on salary. The reason why, both me personally and folks that colleagues and people who worked for me did service in government, despite having a lot of options in the private sector, is because they love the idea of public service. The government still provides all sorts of options for people to do things they couldn't do legally, at least, in the private sector, like hack. And so, what ends up being, I think, the biggest barriers are things like security clearances, where I have students in our cyber policy specialization in our MIP program who are ready to go, but would love to go into federal service, but they can't. There's a chicken or egg problem where they need to have a clearance already in order to be considered for a position, and so just getting their foot in the door is a problem. There's another set of issues around things as simple as like we went through 2 government shutdowns. I mean, you talk about killing the morale of people when Congress shuts down the executive branch and people face furlough and uncertainty about their finances. One area that I think the report would actually help again if the recommendations are implemented is a lot of the people who I encountered who left government for the private sector or elsewhere, coming from cyber mission areas, DHS, FBI, and elsewhere, left because they just got tired of all the process fights, right? It comes back to this uncertainty around organizational mission, jurisdictional boundaries, and budget resources. Not salary, but the resources to be able to perform a task that Congress, the American people, or that the NSC expects them to do. And so I think if you're able to solve for most of those, then the salary issue doesn't go away, but it becomes a lot less important and allows the government to compete on its own, on the basis of its own strengths, as opposed to trying to outdo the private sector when it comes to salary.
One other footnote on that. The other thing is that government is not a great place to move fast and break things, and it may be okay to bust up stuff, to disrupt stuff in the private sector, but government is much less tolerant of that, and with good reason. And so I think that's a fundamental difference in the mindset of the two. Government is supposed to provide continuity and to treat everybody equally, and the private sector doesn't want to see that at all.
So I'd just say two things. One is that I know the National Security Commission (NSC) is looking hard at this set of issues. And I think one of the things they're finding is that there are all sorts of authorities to reduce pain points that haven't been fully utilized. And so I think they're taking a very practical approach to that. So lots of pain points, the things that you guys have talked about already about, red tape, not able to get the best tech, being able to actually have impact, waiting for clearance, where you work, Fort Meade, not a super attractive place for students to go right out of college. But I'd say one other thing, and some of you guys have heard me say this a lot. The federal government is terrible at messaging. It's terrible at the recruitment messaging. Different parts of the government are now competing for this tech talent, right? And so in the private sector, you would never hear of a company saying, 20-year-olds, yeah, they're a fickle cohort, but we're going to keep our marketing message exactly the same for 50 years. And if they don't want to come and join us with our marketing message, the problem is them. The problem is not us. Right, but that's essentially what all the elements of the U.S. government have been doing in trying to get this sort of technical talent in the door. They don't actually empirically test what messages work, right? And so one of the things that I was in the midst of doing with a great undergraduate before COVID-19 disrupted our plans was we at Stanford should be launching an annual survey of CS students about what it is they value and what would be attractive to them with whatever it is that they decide to do, so that there is a constant longitudinal study to understand what kinds of things motivate this generation of tech talent and how can we get them into public service at some form in some way in their career. It just boggles my mind that that DoD in particular, which is super interested in this area, doesn't actually ask the target audience, what would it take to recruit you? Because if you ask undergraduates and give them a slice of pizza, they will tell you.
What about this issue of, are the incentives properly aligned for the private sector to protect critical infrastructure? So obviously, much of the critical infrastructure resides there already. Much of the talent resides there already. And we should expect that, at least from an infrastructure side, that's likely to get more, that issue is likely to be, to increase as a consequence of COVID-19, as more of us move, onto relying on infrastructure, and to include government, people who work for the government relying on private infrastructure. So are the incentives properly aligned for, the big internet infrastructure companies to, cooperate with the federal government and or provide sufficient cybersecurity on their own?
Yeah, No. Yeah. So one of the big debates that came up in the commission as we were forming it was whether the private sector, whether we should be asking for punishment for the private sector if they fail to reach certain obligations. I don't think that ever made it into the final reports. That became far too contentious. One of the big problems that we come up against is that as we talk about the talent, most of these companies are they're better at cybersecurity than the US government. So it can be a little bit hard sometimes for the US government to say that they're going to hold them responsible when the reality is that the US government couldn't defend its own networks at the same capability level as some of these major corporations. So I think what the report tried to do was, instead of creating either punishments or delegating responsibilities within the US government to defend specific private sector, Instead, they were trying to create institutions that would kind of live in that space where there's not already commercial interest to help. So the development of an organization that looks like the CDC, but for cybersecurity, I mean, the point there is to create kind of non-commercial interests that can focus on research and on capabilities that can help all the sectors, right? In increasing the power of some of the organizations within DHS, the idea was not to defend forward not to do defense for these organizations, but instead to provide better analytics, better information gathering, better resources so that these corporations can do more of their own cybersecurity. Now, there's one exception to that, and that's the DIB. The DIB in this report gets called out specifically. Basically, y'all are benefiting from the government anyway. So the DIB, there's a proposal that actually Cyber Command teams will have threat hunting teams.
And Jackie, tell people what the DIB is, since most people
That's right, the Defense Innovation Base. So that's companies like Raytheon, Boeing, Lockheed Martin, big corporations, mostly big corporations. There's a question of like, okay, if you guys implemented this, would this apply to corporations in Silicon Valley that, the DoD is trying to court? They probably wouldn't be as excited about threat hunting on their networks. But that is one place where the commission specifically says, no, the US government and the DoD in particular is going to have a larger role in defending your networks.
You also, there's one coda on that. One element of punishment that did make it into the report was its recommendation for liability. The report does have has a provision about liability for essentially vendors of IT products that incorporate known and patched vulnerabilities, and that's a big deal. That's the first time that I've ever seen an official commission like this recommend some sort of liability.
But it's narrowly tailored for patching, for fast patching, right? That's right.
But it's a step in the right direction.
Okay.
Point is
last question, then we'll let everybody go. But and it really circles back to I think where a bunch of the comments started at the beginning, which is whether the frame around deterrence is the right frame for the commission report. And David Johnson asks, Amy and Jackie, you mentioned that the multi-layered onion idea of cyber deterrence is not as well defined in the report as it could be, and therefore deterrence has become more of an ill-defined, all-encompassing term. What specifically would you recommend to eliminate this ambiguity and formulate deterrence in a more actionable way? Like, is there a way to rescue deterrence as a concept in this, or do you just throw it out and do something else?
So Jackie has stayed muted, so I get to take the first crack at this. Thanks, Jackie. Well, what I was going to say is I think Jackie has hit on the right idea, right? Which is that my understanding at this point, and look, this is a really hard nut to crack, so I'm not going to come up with the magic solution here in 2 minutes left of our seminar. But we think about, where does deterrence work? Where do we want to actually threaten punishments that stop our adversaries from taking actions that we don't want them to take? It's called the high end, right? So that high end of the scale, massive attacks that have massively disruptive effects, whether physical or otherwise. That's where you could think about where it is more credible, getting back to the nuclear posture review, it is more credible to say, if you fill in the blank, then we will counter with a nuclear strike or with a major kinetic strike. So the high end, I think there is more possibility for deterrence. The low end, it's just called defending. We just need to defend and become more resilient. Don't dress it up as deterrence, call it what it is. Reserve, because when deterrence means everything, it means nothing. And so if we reserve the word of deterrence for really what Schelling intended it to be, the threat of violence, right, to keep others from doing what you don't want them to do, then defense becomes a more robust concept as well. And at the low end, I think we need to be thinking about defense and resilience as a part of defense.
Jackie, anything you want to say as a final word?
Yeah, everything Amy said. Completely agree. But I do have a nice little strategy depiction if anyone's interested, that's on Lawfare blog, that does lay out exactly, I think, very close to what Amy just articulated, trying to say what those lines of effort are and where one starts and the other does.
Well, we have reached our time. I hope everybody is staying safe, healthy, and sane in these turbulent times, and will continue to engage with FSI centers to include CSAC and the Cyber Policy Centers.